Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show helping men to open up about manhood. My name is Simon Rennie and my aim is to get men talking. From mental health to fatherhood and everything in between, Mindful Men creates a safe space for conversation. Now, before we get into this episode, I want to say a huge thank you for joining me. It means a world for you to join me and talk about men's issues. And if you love what you hear, please subscribe and share the episode with your mates. You can also join the conversation on Instagram and YouTube, and I'd love to connect with you there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rennie, and today we're getting mindful about mental health, suicide, and social work. Now, a trigger warning that if you do get triggered by discussions around mental health and suicide, please feel free to skip this episode. That's okay. But if you do stick around and you do get triggered, please reach out to your support networks. I'm really excited. I've got a social worker from the Sunshine Coast. It's nice to be talking social work in my local patch. And I've got Gabby Prosser here. And Gabby, you're a mum, an accredited mental health social worker, and the woman giving hope and healing to people needing it on the Sunshine Coast through your business, Hope and Healing. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How was your weekend? It was a beautiful weekend here in Queensland. Did you do anything special or interesting?
Nothing too exciting, just the usual kind of weekend stuff, washing, all that kind of stuff, and then getting ready for the week, but enjoyed some gardening and some sun as well in the middle of all that.
Love it. What's in your garden? Tell us about your garden.
50 million succulents. Way more succulents than any one person actually needs.
Is there a reason that you went to succulents?
Because I'm really shit at gardening, and succulents are the one plant that you can neglect and they won't die, or if they do start to die, you can bring them back. So yeah, I found that that's literally the only plant I can keep alive. So
now we're going to be talking about pineapples today. So I'm the same with pineapples. I've got pineapples all in my backyard and I can just basically put them in the ground, and then later on I'll find a pineapple on them. And after I completely forgot about them for about a year. So I've got about 5 of those going at the moment. Yeah. But welcome to the show. I'm really excited to talk about pineapples today, actually. But we'll start off with a bit about you and just give us a bit of a summary of who you are and where you're from and some of those key life events that bring you here today.
Cool. Okay. Yep. So I am Gabby. As you said, I'm a mental health social worker based here on the Sunshine Coast. So I just work for myself in my own little private practice called Hope and Healing. Yeah, so I guess today, kind of as we were looking at, is a bit of a journey in terms of how I got to my practice and how I got to the Take Your Pineapples Out campaign, which we'll get to a little bit later on. So I lived in Canberra until I was 10. My parents decided they wanted to exchange city life to become farmers. So sold up in Canberra and moved up here to North Arm to this, 40-acre fruit farm, to this tiny little school where there's like 20 kids in my grade, going from, I guess, suburban Canberra to rural life was a massive, massive change for me. But that was a really kind of defining moment in my life, because that's where I met Kai, who we will talk about a bit later on. And I guess that move, whilst I really wasn't happy about it and didn't want it, completely shaped who I am today and where I've come to, and even just calling the Sunshine Coast home, which is pretty significant for me.
Were your parents farmers back in Canberra, or were they public servants?
So Dad was definitely not farmers. Like, they'd done kind of stints of that kind of stuff. They talked about they used to live in this place called Delegate before they had us, which was somewhere in rural New South Wales, in the middle of nowhere. I think when they both grew up, they lived in Albury, like Albury Wodonga, on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. So they'd had kind of experiences with farming on and off throughout their life, but yeah, no, definitely not definitely not farmers in Canberra. And I think Mum had done some time in the public service before she had us. And then she was doing kind of like reception admin type work, and Dad was doing lots of courier work. So yeah, we pretty much never saw him. He was doing one courier job through the day, another courier job through the night. Yeah, so kind of came up here, started fresh with just an orchard that no house or anything on it. So yeah, we had to rent for a little bit while they knocked down trees and built the house. And
It would have been pretty cool growing up on a farm. Like, tell us a bit about like growing up on the farm and being in space. And it's funny that you mentioned rural, because the Sunshine Coast is a weird place like that. You've got the beautiful beaches, and then within half an hour, you're in the middle of nowhere.
absolutely, yeah. Look, throughout my adolescence, I hated it because yeah, there was no public transport. It was impossible to get anywhere. In saying that, I absolutely found ways to get wherever I needed to go. Um, but as I started to get older, and once my son was born, I absolutely loved North Arm. Like, it was just this beautiful, safe place. Um, so yeah, look, and you know, I learned to ride a motorbike when I was 10 years old. And for me, when I would get really overwhelmed or stressed or whatever, I would just jump on the postie bike and I would just go and do laps around the farm, or I'd, you know, ride it down to the big dam and I'd just go and sit at the dam. And, you know, learned to drive a car when I was, I think when we were 13. We got a little bush basher for Christmas. And so, you know, all these awesome experiences that you don't get when you live in suburbia. But I definitely didn't appreciate them for what they were at that time, because I just wanted to be in town, near public transport, near my friends, back in Canberra with all those people. And yeah, but no, look, it was pretty amazing. And particularly then being able to raise my son on the farm throughout his early years of life too was pretty awesome as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Are you still
But
doing
also,
the farm thing, or have you moved into suburbia?
so I'm in suburbia now. My parents sold up the farm. Oh, I think that was maybe around 2017. So I think they did, yeah, about 20 years on the farm.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so big, kind of big stint. And, you know, I often would joke in job interviews that like I felt like I wanted to put on my job, you know, my resume, that I was a farmer's daughter, because I feel like it did give me such a great work ethic, and it gave me such a good understanding of what it means to be committed and to work hard, but also just so much empathy for what farmers go through,
Mm.
and that just at the mercy of Mother Nature or the market. You know, you might be having a really good run and then the market crashes, or it gets flooded with, you know, fruit from overseas, and you've just got all this fruit and it just sits there and it goes to waste. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And was there a specific type of fruit that you grew?
So they had avos, lemons, limes, passion fruit, figs, and they go through periods, like say if they replanted a block while those trees were growing, they'd run like zucchinis kind of down underneath the trees as they were growing. They were the main ones, yeah.
Cool. Now, you mentioned about being a parent as well. So you're a mum. So I love talking about parenting. I'm a parent myself, and I love to hear other parents' thoughts about what it means to be a parent. So yeah, what does it mean to you to be a mum?
And I think that's a really kind of awesome question to reflect on, like what it actually means to be a parent. You know, I think we can talk a lot about what it is, what it requires, but really what it means, I think, is a really cool reflective question. So I think what it means to me to be a parent is trying to articulate it in words, I guess. Like, it is a responsibility and a privilege at the same time to be able to shape, you know, when they're young and when they're growing up, to shape this tiny human who is going to one day become an adult. And I think for me, you know, I was a very reflective teenager. I was a very reflective mum. And for me, I very much wanted to break intergenerational cycles. I wanted
Hmm.
to learn why I was the way I was, and I wanted to do things differently for my son. So I think what it means to me to be a mum is to be able to be reflective and to work on my own shit, to try and make my son's journey through life just even a little bit easier than mine was, than my parents was, than their parents was, to try and break some of those intergenerational cycles that we all have within our families. And yeah, I think, it means to me that we do have the capacity to impart, I guess, our knowledge and our wisdom onto someone else, so that when they do get to a point where they're going out into the world, they have the tools and the skills that they need to navigate just the complexity of day-to-day life. I don't know really how to articulate it. I don't know if I've articulated that well, but yeah, I guess it means that you're shaping someone, and that, yeah, you kind of, I don't know, I think you need to take it seriously to a degree whilst having fun at the same time.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I like to throw it out there because we don't often reflect that way in terms of our parenting. You're right. We think about the roles and the responsibilities and the things we need to get done on the day-to-day, not so much about what it actually means to us deep down to shape humans into different beings and so forth. And I often think about my mental health journey, and I talk about it a lot on the show, and hoping that my kids don't grow up the same as me, but at the same time, if they do, then it's okay, because I know how to get them help and how to support them. And I want to be that guy or that dad or that support person that I never really had growing up, because I bottled it all up, and people in the 80s, 90s and noughties didn't really talk about mental health, particularly in my circles as well. Now, you've got a son, is that right?
Yeah.
How old's your son?
My son is 19 now.
Oh, he's an adult.
He is an adult now, and it is reflecting on a parenting journey. He's in a very different kind of stage now, and it's a very different parenting journey now. But even being able to have conversations with him now, and reflecting on what it means to me to be a parent. One of the things, when I was pregnant, I never found out what gender he was. And, one of the things I regularly thought was that if I had a son, I wanted to raise him to respect women, because throughout my adolescence, I would regularly put myself in situations that meant I didn't get a whole lot of respect throughout, through my own actions, unfortunately, at that point in time. because I didn't have the skills to know better at that time. But I wanted to, I guess, somehow impart the skills, the knowledge, the experiences in him that he would not, treat women in that way. Then he was a son. And then I'm like, how do you actually raise a son to respect women? Like, it's not like when they're 2 and 3, you can sit down and go, okay, this is what you need to do. So yeah, it was really interesting then, being the single parent of a son, going, okay, how do I actually do this? But now that he's 19, we literally, like 2 weeks ago, sat down and we had a discussion around that. And we had a discussion around the fact that he's so beautifully respectful of women, and how I'm so deeply proud of him. And that really, I didn't care what he grew up to do. No, didn't worry me whatsoever. All I cared was that he grew up to, I guess, have broken some of those intergenerational cycles, but that he had respect for women. And yeah, couldn't be more proud of him. So
as a 19-year-old, was he like, Mum, you're getting too like mushy?
No, he's a really beautiful kiddo. And I think, like you said, in terms of that communication stuff, like, he can communicate really well. And he's like, I'm so grateful that you're my mum. And like, yeah, it was just a really sweet conversation. So yeah.
And you mentioned intergenerational stuff going on intergenerationally. Like, I wouldn't be a social worker if I didn't ask if you feel comfortable sharing some of that. What are you talking about for people that aren't familiar with what that even means to start with? Do you care to share, a bit about what you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess when I talk about intergenerational stuff, and I think you really hit on it there, where you talk about like the 80s, 90s, noughties, like we didn't talk about stuff. So I guess when I talk to people about intergenerational stuff, it's never about blame. It's never about, saying that people didn't do things right. It's about acknowledging the culture at that time. And that parents did the best they could with the skills they had at that time. So in my family growing up, my cousin and I will regularly have conversations about the fact that our family, we didn't do emotions and we didn't do communication very well. So most of us Prossers, we really struggled to communicate, to express our emotions. And so that came out in a range of different ways, whether it was through suppressing it or whether it was through unhealthy behaviors and patterns. We've got, I guess, lots of addiction in our family history as well. And so we know that addiction is something that follows generations. So for me, it was very much wanting to set, and I was very much caught in that pattern at the time I fell pregnant. So for me, it was around going, okay, if I want to break that cycle with my son, I know he's got this genetic predisposition to addiction. How do I then model a different behavior? How do I then do things differently to break that cycle? So I guess sidebarring that, so much of what we know, we learn through observation in our early years. So we learn through observing our parents, our grandparents, our, significant family members and the way they do things, the way they interact with each other, the way they communicate. And I feel like we kind of go one of two ways. We either replicate those patterns or we question those patterns and go, why do they do that? Or I want to do things differently. So I guess intergenerational stuff is where these patterns repeat generation after generation, or the impact of those patterns are felt generation after generation.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned like you want to do things differently. So as a parent, when I became a parent, like I was a similar, like I didn't want to go down a similar pathway that I was parented. But then often you fall into that same, not trap, but you fall into that same behavior because that's what like it just becomes innate in you. So then we have to, I guess, either run with that or we start to question it. And so for me, like an example is like I was smacked growing up, and I think a lot of kids in the 80s, 90s, or even like, before that were getting smacked as a behavioral thing. So then I innately smacked Gus once when he was being naughty, and I felt absolutely terrible. I hated it. And it wasn't a hard smack. It was just a light tap on his hand because I thought that was the most appropriate space to smack him. But I've never done it again, and I just hate the thought of doing it. And I'm like, no, I've got to be different. I can't be the same as my parents and their parents and all that. And it's 2022 or 2021 or whenever it happened. I can't remember. But things are different now. Like we know a lot more about parenting and behavior management and all this type of stuff. So if he's going to grow up in an environment where discipline is different, I've got to be the change maker here. And that's what we do in our household. We're really actively like, okay, how do we best, change this intergenerational way of behavior management in our household? And then a lot of dads would probably feel the same, and mums as well. Like you just kind of fall into that, oh, this is what happened to me, and this is going to work for you, but it doesn't necessarily work. And education has come a long way, and research into this space as well. And yeah, it is a tricky thing for parents to navigate in 2022.
I love that example, and I think coming back to that thing of it's not about blame. And again, like so much of what we know, it's just that unconscious stuff. So we are going to fall back into those patterns because it's what we know. But when we realize we're doing it, we can pull ourselves out of it. And I think I guess a really kind of defining moment for me where I realized I'd given my son tools that I never had is like when he was around 10 or so. When I get really overwhelmed with emotion, I go quiet. So that kind of passive aggressive silent treatment, I just withdraw into myself because that's how I grew up. You don't talk about stuff, you just go quiet. And it's automatic. It just happens. I don't realize I'm doing it. And he would always come up to me and go, "What's wrong, Mum?" I just go, "Nothing." Again, pattern. I'm not realizing I'm doing it. And he'd go, "Your face doesn't look like it." And I'd be like, "Oh, bless. I love that I've given you the tools to actually tell me that my words aren't matching my face." Because I wouldn't have said something like that when I was younger. I wouldn't have been brave enough to do that. No. So that would then give me pause to go, okay, I've fallen back into that pattern. I'd take myself off, I'd do my strategies, regroup, and then I could actually go and sit with him and say, look, yeah, no, I wasn't okay. this is what was going on. Either it wasn't anything to do with you or it was, and we would talk about it. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. And that always kind of sticks in my head as a defining moment of going, cool, I've done it. Yeah, sure, I'm going to slip back into these patterns, but I've still given him the tools and the skills, even though I slip back into these learned behaviors. So,
Yeah, and I think the key thing is that it's okay to slip back as long as
yeah.
we keep coming back, and keep reflecting on that, because as parents, we think we need to be perfect all the time, and good enough parenting actually works. Like, we got to give ourselves a break as well, and go, we're not perfect. Perfectionism doesn't exist as much as I like to think it does in my brain, or a lot of parents think about in their brains. But yeah, we just got to take it easy and know that kids are resilient as well. They can really pick it up. And I love how he saw that facial expression on you, and he just said it how it was.
Yeah.
And it's often a great learning tool, because my kids do similar as well. They're like, well, you're saying one thing, but you're not meaning that what you're saying, Dad. Yeah, it's such an interesting story. And I love hearing about these journeys about parenting and growing up as well, because it really shapes us as humans as to where we end up in a career. And so I'd love to talk a bit about social work and how you landed into social work. So can you tell us a bit about why you pursued social work? How did social work come into your mind as a career choice, and what's some of those things that you've done as a social worker?
So it's a bit of a kind of a process and a journey, and I guess a bit of a story. So I'll summarize it as quickly and succinctly as I can. But yeah, like as I mentioned earlier, I was already kind of falling into some of those addictive and unhealthy patterns already in my adolescence, which led to me falling pregnant at 16. And so I dropped out of school when I was 15, was just working at the local ginger factory and cafe, fell pregnant at 16. And my sister was in her first year of her psychology undergrad down at UQ. And I'm sure it was done with all the best intentions, but I remember her telling me the statistics that surround the children of, I guess, uneducated young single parents. And I just remember thinking at that time, like, my son is not, or my child, because I didn't know what he was, my child's not going to be another statistic, because I'm making a choice to bring them into the world when I'm young, single, uneducated, etc. So I guess that was probably the start of me going, I need to do more with my life than just continue to work at the ginger factory after I have my child. So then when my son was about 6 months old, my friend's mum, who is a social worker, had mentioned that there was a young parents play group starting up here in Nambour. So I went along to that, and after probably 12 months or so of going along to that, I remember one day asking the lovely lady who ran the play group, I'm like, so like, what are you? Like, what does it take for you to just be able to come and hang out and just chat with us? Like, what do you have to do to get paid to do this? Like, I didn't realize at the time that she did more than just hang out and chat with us. There's so much that goes into the facilitation of the young parents play group. And she's like, oh, I'm a social worker. I'm like, okay, so like, what is a social worker? What does a social worker do? So she kind of told me a bit about it. So then I started to get a bit curious, and like each group I'd kind of come back, and if like, one of the pregnant mums was outside smoking, I'd kind of go up to her and I go, so like, as a social worker, if you see like a pregnant mum smoking, what would you do? And she'd be like, well, hypothetically, if I was working with a mum who was smoking, I'd talk to them about why, I'd find out what's going on for them. I might do some education around it, but ultimately I'd understand what it means for them, and I'd support them, as they need it. I'm not going to make judgments. I'd be like, oh, okay. And then like I'd go away and I'd kind of come back a couple of weeks later. And if I saw a parent who wasn't parenting the way I thought a parent should, I'd go up and be like, so what would a social worker do with like a parent like that? I was a little bit judgmental back then. And she'd be like, well, hypothetically, she introduced me to the term hypothetically. Loved it. As a social worker, if a social worker was working with a parent who was struggling, they might do some home visits, or they might do some surplus security work, or, they might link them in with an early intervention specialist, or even just coming along to a play group like this can be really helpful. I'd be like, oh, okay. So through going to that group, through just curiously asking her these questions and her being really nice and giving me these hypothetical responses, it opened me up to this idea of social work. And then I decided that, I think at that time I was going to enroll in just the Diploma of Community Service at TAFE, but the Young Parents Program, they got a funding grant to run a 6-month TAFE course called Skills for the Future. So it was teaching us all different life skills and things like, improving self-talk and building support networks. And as part of that, so one day we'd do these life skills, and the second day we were making a video about the reality of what it means to be a young parent. And the idea was that we were going to use these videos to go and do education within schools about the reality of life as a young parent. And at that point in time, there was a lot of stigma around young parents because it was the baby bonus era. For some reason, this belief that young parents were having babies just for the money. I don't know where it came from. Absolutely, they weren't. But yeah, so we were kind of working on that. So I decided to do that instead, and got to meet 2 other amazing guys who work in the community services sector here on the coast as well. So after I did that, I then decided to go back and do my year 11 and 12. So I did that through distance ed, and then decided to enroll in social work. And by that time, USC were finally offering it here on the Sunshine Coast.
Cool. What was it like going back to study and having a young child, like as in that age, like trying to go back and do year 11 and 12? Like, what was that like?
Interestingly, when I was at school, I was failing all my subjects. Like, I saw my report card, 10 years or so ago, and I was getting D's in all my subjects, just failing. When I did my year 11 and 12, A's in every single subject. So I think it shows that when you actually are applied and want to do something, you can do it really well. So it was difficult to find, I guess, the time being a single parent. I think by the time I ended up doing my year 11 and 12, Zach was about 2. So I put him in daycare 2 days a week. So I had 2 days a week where I could sit at home and focus on doing my study. Surprisingly, I was quite disciplined, and I actually did sit at home and do my study on those days. But yeah, juggling it all was quite difficult.
Where did the inspiration come? Because I can imagine myself at that age, and I never had a child, but I dropped out of year 12 after a relationship breakdown, went back and did year 13. But to do that as a single mum, with a child, and parenting is damn hard, and I'm doing this in my 30s. You're doing this at in your late teens. It must have been someone in your life, or there must have been some sort of inspiration. Was it your sister, your family, or was it just internalized and you just wanted a better life?
It was all just my son. I really just wanted more for him than the situation he was born into. I did not want my situation at that time to define his life outcomes. Yeah, so I guess he was always my driving factor in, I need to create a better life for him.
Yeah, because you hear so many stories of young, single mums who have a baby very young, like you, and just fall into that system of poverty and welfare as well. But yeah, for you to pull yourself out, it's just, it's an amazing story. It's so inspiring. And I think it'd be inspiring for other young mums out there that you can have a baby and get a career and do it single, and live an amazing life. So you got into social work. So what made you pursue us to become an accredited mental health social worker? Can you describe what that is for people who aren't familiar with that? Because I do talk, we have listeners in the US who that's more of a licensed social worker. What's an accredited mental health social worker, and why did you pursue this particular career path?
The term accredited mental health social worker is a social worker who has a degree in social work in Australia, recognised by the AMHSW, the Australian Association of Social Workers. is a member of the Australian Association of Social Workers and has 2 years full-time equivalent post-grad experience in like a clinical mental health role. Whilst doing that experience, you have also met specific continuing professional development requirements, which include a certain amount of supervision, a certain amount of training in therapies, a certain amount of training in mental health. And then at the end of that, you have done an application to demonstrate that you meet the skills and requirements and that you have the required knowledge in order to be able to provide services under Medicare or through the Department of Veterans Affairs.
So that, I guess that opens up the door to subsidized support for a client, maybe. So for example, I'm not an accredited mental health social worker. I'm just a social worker. I can't access Medicare like support. So people who come and see me can't access subsidized, counseling or whatever, but they can for you. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Wonderful. And so why did you go, okay, I want to be an accredited mental health social worker? Like, what was that drive?
I guess the drive for me, and again, kind of we'll get to the take your pineapples out stuff, but I'm pausing because I'm trying to find the right word to use. We don't have a word in our Western culture that describes the relationship we had. I'll just use the term best friend for now, but from kind of 2010 until she died in 2015, like supporting my best friend through the mental health system, I saw so many gaps. And I guess for me, it was always the goal. Once I realized that there was this thing called a mental health social worker, accredited mental health social worker, I realized that for me to actually find a way to work within these gaps, I had to work for myself. And yeah, I guess ultimately that lived experience of supporting a loved one through the mental health system, seeing the gaps and the flaws in the system, this was a way for me to try and prevent others from falling through the gaps. So yeah.
And what some of those gaps that you saw, like what are you talking about when you say gaps?
A lack of practitioners who are able to work with personality disorders. And I it's unfortunate that throughout my years of working in the mental health space, I hear a lot of negativity. If you hear the diagnosis borderline personality disorder, there is immediately a lot of stigma, unfortunately, around that diagnosis. So I guess I found a lack of practitioners who were willing or able or had the skills to work with people with personality disorders, a lack of practitioners or services at that time who were able to work with people who struggled with suicide, with suicidal thoughts, who repeatedly presented to hospital after suicide attempts. Absolutely no follow-up once someone was discharged from hospital. Even just a lack of support or knowledge or engagement with families or contact. If someone's being discharged from hospital to a home, why not just actually have a conversation with the people in that home? Like, don't just discharge them and send them off. So yeah, just so many gaps.
Yeah.
So many.
Wow. And so when did you become an accredited mental health social worker?
2018, I finally completed everything, got my accreditation.
Awesome. And so what were you doing before that? Like, were you doing other roles or were you in that mental health space as well?
So I moved into the mental health space in 2014. So from 2014 till 2018, I was working towards my accreditation. Unfortunately, when I moved over to the space in 2014, I didn't fully realize the process. So when I actually went to apply, I was like, oh, okay, I actually need to do this and this. So then I had to start from that point. So it took me a little bit longer than I anticipated. So yeah, I was working for a non-government mental health service from 2014 to 2017. So the program was called CHIME. It no longer exists, but it was a hospital diversion program. So it was for people with a severe and persistent mental illness who frequently either presented to hospital in a mental health crisis or who had frequent hospital admissions. So the aim was around doing intensive case management in the community to try and keep people well and out of hospital. So it was literally filling those gaps that I could see with my best friends. So I was really excited about that program. And then from there, I went over to a local private hospital on the Sunshine Coast and worked in the mental health inpatient unit there until I started my private practice.
What was it like working in the mental health area in the hospital? Was that confronting, or was it a good experience?
It was honestly probably one of my favorite roles, which is probably a weird term to use when you work in the mental health space, but it was probably wouldn't use the term confronting, but I guess what it really showed me is that mental health doesn't discriminate. It can impact anyone. So I worked with people from every single profession you could possibly imagine in that clinic. And I guess some things that I probably found confronting was how long people delayed getting help because of things like stigma. They were worried about what their family, what their colleagues, what it would do to their career, etc. And then what that delay meant for their recovery. Even just concerns around things like insurances. If I access mental health support, then this is going to fuck up my capacity to access insurance or get insurance. But what I found amazing about doing that role is that, I think I was working 30 hours a week and you're in the ward all the time. And I was running 3 groups a day, 4 days a week. So that's 12 hours a week. You're sitting with people. So you get to know people on such a different level. I've never done any other role where I spend a minimum of 12 hours a week with someone. So you really get to know people, in just such a different way. So I absolutely love that role, and it was such a privileged position. But at the same time, I guess where I started to struggle is that you don't see the people who get better, because people who come for an admission and get better, they're not coming back. You don't see them again. You see the people who are continuing to struggle. And so I guess that's where I did start to get quite overwhelmed in terms of like, what's the answer? What do we do? And I guess that's when kind of going into private practice really helped me go, okay, no, actually, we do get better. People can get better. It's just like seeing it in that hospital setting, because obviously, as I said, people don't come back if they're getting better.
It's interesting what you said about people like delaying going to get help around that stigma and shame, and even like the financial component. So that example you provided of not being able to get insurance, that's happened to me. So I've lived with a mental illness since I was 8 or so, and we're looking at our superannuation recently, and we've moved out of the superannuation fund and we do ours through a financial advisor. And part of that process was looking at our insurances and going, okay, like life insurance and all that. And because I live with a mental illness, that part of my insurance was excluded. I couldn't, access that. So it's a really interesting thing because it does impact us, and we're trying to talk about it openly and say that it's okay to be not okay. Yet when you do, these are some of the implications that people think about. But I guess it's knowing that there are other supports around. So maybe insurance is not the thing that you might be able to access, but you're able to access like therapeutic support or group work or other support systems in the community, which can help you through times of crisis as well. But let's talk about suicide, and suicide is I'm not sure if it's a pun or anything like that. It's a prickly subject because we're talking about pineapples, including for people working in the mental health space. So, I mentioned the word suicide on the podcast I was on the other day, and the host was like, whoa, what have we got about to talk about here? And I think there's a lot of stigma just associated with this word, but it's something that we do need to talk about. And you mentioned that you've lost your best friend to suicide. And then you started the Take Your Pineapples Out campaign to help raise awareness of suicide and start conversations about it. So as much as you're okay to talk about, tell us a bit about Kai and your friendship, and then how her suicide impacted you.
So I met Kai when I was 10. So when we moved up here from Canberra, and my parents enrolled me in North Arm Primary. Again, there's like 20 kids in the grade. If we imagine half the grade is guys, half the grade is girls. There's like 10 girls that I had to try and break into this friendship group. So it's really difficult to break into kind of an already established friendship group. But Kai and I kind of hit it off immediately, because she was just, kind of as weird and quirky as I was, and we just had so much fun together. But she would always, I guess it was already this established friendship group, so she already had a best friend. So she would always say to me, like, Gabby, such and such is my best friend, you're my sister. So like right from when we were 10, we kind of had this running joke that we weren't best friends, we were sisters, and then kind of turned into like we were soulmates. And like I literally believed, she was my soulmate. I call her like my platonic life partner. Like she just, from the age of 10, we were Gabby and Kai. Everyone just knew that was who we were. And so I feel like when I use the term best friend, it doesn't encapsulate the relationship that we had. Like she was my person. So I guess in losing her, it was like losing my sister and my soulmate and my best friend and my husband, like all in one. Just one day this person was there, and then the next day this person was gone. So, kind of from the age of 10, we were always together. I talked about that role that I was doing in the community called Chime. Like it was a really full-on intensive role. And so when I would kind of be driving between clients just to clear my head, like she's the person I would call, not to talk about work. We'd just literally talk. She might be telling me about the last time she did a poo, or like some random story that had just happened to her. Like she was just always the person that I went to. And there was just always so much laughter and so much fun and spontaneity. And my son, when he was young, like I don't have any brothers, so she was Uncle Kai. And then I remember like when probably he was like 9 or 10, and he used to play Minecraft with his mates, and they'd all be on like a conference call on speakerphone. And then they'd be talking about, we're going to go to dinner, or we're going to go here. And then his mates would all be like, oh, is Kai coming? And Zach would be like, oh, yeah. And they'd all be so excited. Like they all just loved Kai. Like at the time she died, he would refer to her as like his best friend as well. So she was just, very much a part of our family. So like her death just completely shattered my world, not just my world, but also my identity and who I was, because I'd been, part of Gabby and Kai since I was 10 years old. And then all of a sudden I'm just Gabby, and Kai's not here anymore. And like, what does that mean? Like, we always had this joke around like she was my right leg and I'd have to hop through life without her. And then all of a sudden I'm having to hop through life. Like, how do I actually do that? So losing her just completely broke me and led me to having to find a way to try and rebuild myself whilst working in a role where I was literally working with people every single day who were suicidal, who didn't want to live anymore. So also from a career perspective, it could have broken my career as well.
Yeah. And like when did this happen? Like was it a recent thing or a while back now, or?
So it was 3rd of November 2015. So it's coming up to nearly 7 years now.
Yeah. Wow. And how old was your son when this happened?
He was 12 when she died.
Yeah. And so like, you've both lost your best friend or your sister or your uncle for your son's sake. Like what was the grieving process like? What did you go through together and individually to try and process what had happened? Like, was it like out of the blue, or did you kind of see it coming? Like, can you describe that for us?
Yeah. So at that point in time, for me, it was out of the blue. So she started talking about suicide in 2010, and her first suicide attempt was in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
So from 2011 until probably 2014, maybe, I lost track of the amount of hospital admissions.
Mm-hmm.
I lost track of the amount of months she spent in hospital. So I think, beginning of 2011, she had a 3-month hospital stay, which is pretty significant. I learned once I started working in Chime, it's rare that people have that long a hospital stay. And yeah, just it kind of became the norm. And I involved my son throughout that process. And I guess for me, in wanting to talk to him about stuff, like I would talk to him about Kai's mental health, we would go and visit her at hospital together. Like, I didn't hide it, but at the same time didn't talk about the fact as to why she was there. It was just, Kai was struggling. Kai wasn't doing very well. We'll go visit her in hospital for her mental health. But I didn't talk about the fact that she had attempted suicide, and that's why she was there.
Yeah.
So throughout that period, that kind of 4-year period, I literally expected any point in time that I would get a call and that would be it. Like, I would go to sleep at night and I would kind of write her eulogy in my head. There were times where she was missing and we had no idea where she was. So I would just be sitting there kind of just anticipating that phone call was going to come. But at the beginning of 2015, she ended up out in Cherbourg. And from there, she got her own house in this cute little town called Tingura out near Kilcoy. So throughout the whole kind of period, 2011, 2014, she didn't ever have a base. Like, she'd be discharged from hospital back to our house and she'd kind of live with us. About 3 weeks or so was kind of her max before she'd slip and she'd disappear for a while, hospital, back to our house. So she lived with us on and off throughout that period. And then, so through 2015, she had her own home. She was doing volunteer work. She had every support service under the sun. So I finally just breathed this sigh of relief, like, oh, we've come through it. Like, she's actually doing really well. So for me, it was completely unexpected. I think I'd let my guard down, and I was like, when her mum rang me, I was at work, and her mum said to me, she's like, oh, it's what we've always feared. And I just remember my thought being, but I stopped fearing this. Like, I wasn't fearing this anymore. And I just remember saying, fuck. And then in my head, I'm like, oh no, I just said fuck to Kai's mum. And then in my head, I'm like, why aren't I crying? Why aren't I screaming? Like, I should be crying. I should be screaming right now. And I think for me, that was the first kind of realization that grief doesn't happen like it does in the movies. Like in the movies, you see someone get news of a loved one who's died and they scream and they wail and they cry. And I think for me, that moment was the first realization that this is going to be different to anything I've ever known. I guess I've learned a lot about grief since then. And obviously that first part of grief is shock. So your brain goes into shock to try and make sense of actually what's happened and what's going on. And I find that first couple of hours so fascinating. So I was at work, obviously, when I got this call, and it was the end of the day. I only had one colleague left at the office. And she was kind of sitting behind me when I got the call. And when I had this thought of, I'm not crying, why aren't I crying? I took myself off into another room and was talking to her mum. And then I did start crying. And then finished the call, got off the phone, walked out. And my colleague was just kind of standing there with this just terrified look on her face. And she's just said to me, and I really appreciated her honesty in that moment. She just said, I have no idea what to say right now. And I think that's something that I just always want to get across to people. Is you don't have to have the words. She just said, I have no idea what to say right now. I didn't want to leave you alone.
Yeah.
And I just really appreciated that. So I just thanked her for staying. I'm like, look, it's all good. I'm going to have to kind of wrap things up here and leave. And I found it quite fascinating that just got like the worst news of my life, but then I was able to sit down at my computer, cancel my appointments for the rest of the week, put the out of office on my phone and my email. My team leader was on leave, but I emailed her boss and let her know that I was going to be off and I didn't know when I'd be back. And then as I got up to go and start to lock up the office, I realized that I was about to have to drive home and tell Zach. And that's when it just completely hit me and I just kind of broke down, then got my shit together so I could kind of leave. So, yeah, like I guess kind of coming back to your question in terms of what was grief like. How do I articulate? Like, I don't think you can have any understanding or comprehension of what grief is like until you've lost a significant person in your life. It was, yeah, like honestly the worst experience I've ever had. And I had no idea that it was such a physical experience too. Like grief isn't an emotion. Like it's literally a process the human body goes through. And I remember that night, like after Zach had gone to bed and I was just sitting there on the edge of the lounge and it hit me that she was gone. And I just literally felt like my heart break, like the physical pain in my chest was phenomenal. And just, yeah, it's a full body experience. It's a full mind experience, full emotion experience. Grieving is fucking exhausting. It's intense and it impacts on every single function. And I realized, I guess, at some point in coming weeks, months, that the only way through it was to actually go through it. And I caught up with a friend on Friday who unfortunately also lost her sister not that long after I'd lost Kai. And so we went through the process together, and she said that when we used to talk about it, she would always think about that going on a bear hunt song, like you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you have to go through it. And I'm like, oh, perfect. And she's like, I swear that was written about grief.
Wow. And like I haven't, personally gone through that kind of experience. The only people that I've known of people who have died by suicide. One was when I was in primary school, so it was one of my friend's sisters. Another one was an ex-work colleague. But aside from that, for me, like, and my sister passed away, but not from suicide. But that was before I was even born. So it kind of lingers in my heart, but it's not something I've ever experienced personally. But then aside from that, it's just grandparents. So I haven't really been around, very close family member or loved one passing away. So I can't imagine what you'd be going through. Was it a long process to go through, and what's some of the things that helped you, pick yourself up and move through that?
It was so fucking long, like it so long. And I think that's something I wasn't expecting, because I guess what I really learnt through my own grief is there's a lot of stigma around grief. And I think it's because people are so uncomfortable with emotions. I think in our Australian culture, emotions scare the shit out of us. And grief is such a complex emotion and it's so intense that grief scares the shit out of people. So people who are grieving feel the need to squish it down and not put it out there. And I started to feel that. So I knew that in order to continue to do my work, I needed to process my grief. And I needed, I lived alone with my 12-year-old son. I literally didn't have anyone to support me through it. I needed to hold my shit together for him. I needed to hold my shit together for the clients that I worked with. So I'm like, how do I do this and be supported? So I would often post things on my Facebook page. But what I started to find probably about 2 months after is I'd start to get these comments of, I think you need to move on, or I think you've got PTSD. And I've started to find these comments. I'm just like, ooh, like that's not sitting right with me. Like 2 months and I need to move on. Like, yeah. So what I did and what helped me was I just started just a random Facebook page and I called it One Little Pineapple. And it's closed now, so you can't see it, but it was just a blog. So I just created this page where I could just blog my grief. So I was no longer doing it on my personal page. And so I wouldn't get those kind of comments. So I've always been able to write my emotions, not necessarily been able to talk them. So I found writing them was significantly helpful. And what I found is that I get that shared experience or that shared acknowledgement through people who just randomly found the page and started following it. What I also found incredibly helpful at that time was my external supervisor. And I distinctly remember kind of the defining moment in supervision was not long after she died. And I remember just sitting with him and just going like, what's the fucking point? Like she had every service under the sun, you know, we tried for so long and she died. So like, what's the fucking point? Why am I doing this? And he was incredibly blunt and he said, I can't answer that for you, but you need to figure it out and you need to do it soon, or you need to get out of the field because you're going to hurt someone with that attitude. And it's like, yeah, you're right. So I guess for me, a way through my grief was finding a point. I needed to find a point or I needed to change my career. And my point was making sure that no one else that I worked with lost their life. No one else fell through the gaps. No other family had to go through that grief and that bereavement. And obviously I know I can't control the outcomes, but doing as much as I could with the skills that I had to try and avoid that. So I guess finding a point, not of her death, never of her death, but of my grief. So that really helped me in moving forward through it. And understanding grief, understanding what I was going through was incredibly helpful. But I guess once this kind of pineapple became a symbol that people started to associate with Kai, something interesting I started to notice was people started to buy me pineapple stuff or give me pineapples or share things of pineapples with me. And what I realized was people didn't know how to support me in my grief. People didn't know how to talk about it. But this was this symbol where they could say, hey, I'm thinking of you and I'm thinking of Kai. And here's something to show you that I'm thinking of you and Kai. So this really just inconspicuous innate object suddenly became an avenue for people to start to open up and connect and say, here, you know, I don't know how to say it, but I'm thinking of you. So
I imagine you've got this room full of pineapple stuff.
I'm thinking like the crazy pineapple lady. It's bizarre.
So let's talk about Take Your Pineapples Out. So it's a campaign you started to help raise awareness of suicide and start conversations about it. So first of all, why pineapples? I mean, we're on the Sunshine Coast. When I first heard about this campaign, I'm like thinking about the big pineapple, and I thought that was just a connection for place, not so much of what it particularly means for your relationship with Kai. So can you tell us first about why the pineapple, and then, a bit about the campaign and what you hope to achieve with it?
So the pineapple kind of came when we were trying to think of something that we could put in the ocean at her memorial. And so I was trying to come up with something that I could put in the ocean. Like flowers were just too kind of normal for Kai. So she used to always love like grapes and dates, but I was like, no, that just doesn't feel right. So I asked my son, I'm like, what's something we can put in the ocean at Kai's memorial? And immediately he's like, a pineapple. So yes, perfect. So we went and found the perfect pineapple that we could put in the ocean at her memorial. And so just from that, like the pineapple then just started to become this symbol of Kai. And so that's why I named my blog One Little Pineapple. And then I guess the reason of the pineapple is we just had so many random stories with Kai and pineapples. Like it just kind of became this weird theme throughout the years where we just had all these random pineapple stories with her. So I guess that's why my son picked the pineapple. And then I guess where Take Your Pineapples came from is through my blog on the first anniversary of her death, I just suggested that if people wanted to, on the 3rd of November, they could do something with a pineapple, just in honor of Kai, that they could, take a pineapple somewhere, or they could introduce a pineapple to a family member that she hasn't got to meet yet, or they could take their pineapples out in honor of Kai. And I was just blown away by how many people embraced the idea and got involved with it. So I didn't intentionally sit down and start this campaign. Like, it was literally just a way of honoring her on the 1st anniversary of her death. And then the next day I woke up to a message from a guy I went to school with, Dion, and he's like, love this idea. Hope you don't mind, but I've registered a domain name and I want to start a website, and I think we could take this further. I think this is an awesome idea. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, okay, cool. And so it just kind of grew from there. And even like the prickly subject, like even that. So my friend's mum, when she was talking to her about taking pineapples out, she's like, oh, that's perfect, because suicide is a prickly subject. So I was like, oh. So it's something that's evolved through the people. It's not something I have ownership over, and that I'm really precious of it. I love people's input, and it's just grown and shaped over the years through the passion and input from others. So
yeah, and is it something you do each year, or is it something that you're looking to get going again? Like, tell us about what's next for it.
So historically, it was an annual day. So up until I think last year, up until 2021, it was an annual day. So the day that people would take their pineapples out. So it's a social media campaign. So the idea is people would upload images of them taking their pineapples out with the hashtag take your pineapples out, as a way of generating conversations about suicide. But I guess one that I found, in order to run a social media campaign in that way, takes a lot of time and energy. And I just, throughout the COVID kind of mental health crisis, I just started to lack the time and energy. Also, with the changing way of social media, I started to see less engagement with the campaign. But what I also started to realize is it shouldn't just be one day. Like, every day is a day to take your pineapples out. Every day is a day to have conversations about suicide and about mental health. And every day is a day to start to raise awareness. So I wanted to step away from focusing on it being just one day. And I think I also just needed a breather. I just needed to regroup and catch up after the kind of craziness of the mental health crisis throughout COVID, and decide where I wanted to go to next. So I guess where to next for me is just finding new ways to make every day a day to take your pineapples out, to make every day a day to raise awareness and have these conversations, and to just offer more opportunities to talk about these things that people struggle to talk about, and to just get the message out there and prevent more people having to lose their life and more loved ones having to go through this experience.
Yeah, I like how you said that every day should be a day to take your pineapples. I feel very similar about the Are You OK Day. We recently had that in Australia. We're talking about mental health awareness and having a day where you ask your mates how they are. But we just shouldn't just wait for one day a year. We should be doing it regularly, as a regular everyday thing. And the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it in like mental health, and in the same way that we normalize our physical health, because we won't think twice about saying I've got to go see a doctor about my back or my leg or whatever, but not so much about our mental health and our well-being as well. So I really love this campaign, and I'm keen to see how it blossoms and fruits. And let's talk about your business now. So you're a savvy business owner of Hope and Healing, and you're in your office right now. Tell us a bit about your business and what some of the services you provide. Like, do you specialize in suicide, or do you have a niche or anything like that? Or do you just open the door to anybody who needs a bit of help?
So I guess the services that I provide are mostly therapy. So I don't tend to provide so much social work service. It's just really hard to do in a private practice space. So most of the work that I do is therapy. And I guess my areas of specialty are in things like personality disorders, complex trauma, people who do struggle with suicidal thoughts, PTSD, veterans, But I love working with young people as well in terms of an early intervention capacity to prevent people getting to those spaces. So I guess I have a general target group in that I'll work with anyone from kind of any age range. But ultimately, yeah, my areas of expertise fit within the kind of complex trauma, suicide risk, suicide prevention, PTSD arena.
Yeah. And do you do telehealth, or do you mainly in the clinic there, or do you get out and about as well?
Mostly in the clinic. I do offer telehealth, but it's not my preferred method. So face-to-face is very much my preferred method, but where there's no other options, absolutely, I will offer telehealth. It's all about trying to break down gaps. I used to do a lot of home visits, but I just found it difficult navigating the diary in terms of this person needs an office appointment here, this one here, home visit. Like, yeah, it got really full on. So yeah, with current clients where there is an identified need, I need to go and see them, we'll find a way to do that. But predominantly it's, office work, telehealth, phone if needed.
Yeah, cool. And so how can people access your services? Do they need a referral, or can they just walk in your door? Like, what does it look like for someone who needs some support?
Probably the best way would be to shoot me an email. So like at this point in time, unfortunately, I've had to close my book, so I can't take any new referrals at this point in time. And for me, that's purely just about making sure I have enough appointments available for all the people I'm currently working with. So the best way to access is shoot me an email and see if I have capacity at this point in time. And then it all depends on the way in which they want to access services. So if they're just wanting to pay for sessions, no, you don't need a referral. You just give me a call. If they're wanting sessions through DVA or Medicare, yes, you need a GP referral. If it's through NDIS, no, you don't need a GP referral. You just contact me. So I guess that's the difficult thing is there's so many different funding bodies, and every different funding body has a different requirement. So that's where too often it's just easier. Just shoot me an email and I can help people understand what's needed.
And where can people access your contact details? You've got a website?
Yep. So the website is hopeandhealing.com.au.
Awesome. And it's got your phone number there and your email and all that type of stuff. Wonderful. Gabby, it's been a really fantastic chat this morning. Really appreciate your time. I like to leave people with a bit of something that makes them feel good. So I'd love to hear what makes you feel good at the moment. Is it you're reading a good book, or watching a good TV show, listening to some awesome music? Are you doing a self-care activity that's really cool at the moment? What can you plug so that some of our listeners can maybe tune into that as well and feel good about their days?
Look, I guess what makes so many things that make me feel good ultimately, and I think one of your last podcasts, you reviewed The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck guided journal, I went through that recently, and that made me feel quite good, quite motivated, gave me lots of tools and strategies for making change within my own life. So I'm going to give that one a plug. But ultimately, overall, what makes me feel good is a good work-life balance, and actually making sure I've got time to do the things that make me feel good, and that my time when I'm not outside work isn't just filled with all the chores and stuff. So, yeah.
I'll get a link to that book. I haven't got through that one yet. I haven't purchased it, so that might be the next on my purchase list. So, and it's really important around work-life balance as well, and not just hustling all the time as a business owner. And closing your book to service the clients that you've got, so that they have your availability and full attention. Because there's nothing worse getting into therapy, and I've experienced this myself, where you see someone for a fortnight or so, and then the next one's available in 2 months. It's really frustrating because you can never get that traction. So it sounds like your system's working really well for your clients. But Gabby, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to talking more about pineapples with you over the journey. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.